Hello and welcome to our first Student Scholar Dialogue, hosted by Emily Laurent-Monaghan for the Paris Institute. I'm joined today by Dr. Samir Gandesha here in Vancouver, Canada. I will briefly introduce Samir before we begin. An international scholar, Samir Gandesha was born in Nairobi, Kenya, and immigrated to Canada with his family in the mid-1960s. Educated in Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United States, Dr. Gandesha is a professor of humanities at Simon Fraser University here in Vancouver, where he serves as the director of the Institute for the Humanities. An engaged writer, Dr. Gandesha has written widely and has edited important volumes on Arendt, Adorno, and Marx. His writing extends beyond academic milieus into the realm of what we might call public philosophy and theory. Thank you for joining me, Samir.
Thanks, Emily. It's a real pleasure to be here with you.
Great. So let me begin. You have been active throughout the pandemic, and I want to discuss some of the articles and talks that you've put forth. In May 2020, you wrote about the gift of COVID-19, wherein you tease out the association between the German Das Gift and the English gift. We have been presented with a poisonous lesson, or brutal universalism, as you call it, that issues from the shadowy double of philosophical wonder, that is, philosophy as traumatic incursion. If the pandemic is a kind of poison gift, insofar that the moment of crisis is utterly decisive, would you say that we have allowed ourselves to be sufficiently poisoned?
Yeah, that's a very provocative way to frame the question. I would maybe turn it around a little bit and wonder whether we have adequately received the gift in the English sense, and that means, have we really been able to consider all the ramifications of the pandemic for our present and for our future? I mean, the pandemic has revealed many, I think, let's say, hidden truths about our society, about our late capitalist order, that, I mean, were certainly known before it struck, but were easier to deny. But now it seems that these dimensions are increasingly difficult to deny. And we could talk about a wide range of things, everything from policing and surveillance through to the weaknesses that we have in our public health care system, which is admittedly better than that of the United States, but we're seeing the problems within the Canadian public health care system, the country's inability to, or zero capacity for the production of vaccines, which we know we're going to need in the future on an ever greater scale, I think. This is not just, it's not the first pandemic, and it won't be the last. How prepared are we for future pandemics? We've seen the way in which the pandemic has overarchingly and disproportionately affected the most vulnerable members of our society, women, racialized communities, indigenous communities. What lessons are we going to learn from this going forward? I think this is really the crucial question. But it's not just one of, theory, which means in its original meaning to look on. It doesn't mean this sort of passive observation of the contours of the present, but it calls for a kind of intervention, because the future, in a sense, is, I mean, to quote Joe Strummer, the future is unwritten. And I think we have to sort of make interventions to secure the kind of future that we want and that we need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And in terms of the sort of discourse cluster and these terms that have emerged through the pandemic, I was hoping we could talk about the sort of rhetoric of safety first, which has become a key bookend within university discourse, but also within the sort of pandemic lexicon. And how has the pandemic, deepened or perhaps affected the political membrane of the classroom, as many of us are, in this online world now? And perhaps you could speak to how online education has affected your thinking about safe space and this language of safety, and the necessity to defend a pedagogy that can sort of suffer, to put it dramatically, sort of negativity and otherness and sort of thinking through our time.
Okay, yeah, so there was quite a number of questions there. And I think first off, we do need to think about safety in a broader sense, obviously, in terms of public health protocols. And I think that this is a very urgent matter, isn't it? That we need to make sure that, we are following the protocols, we're physically distancing, we're, washing our hands, and all those sorts of things. I don't need to go into too much detail about what they are. They are changing, obviously, as we have various kinds of variants of concern, as they're called, released into our ecosystems and so on. But we more or less know what they are. We're seeing increasingly a kind of challenge to these protocols, not from, let's say, the far left, but from the far right, from neo-Nazi organizations, from conspiracy theorists, from white supremacists. And that leads to all kinds of questions about why this might be. And I think that's quite a big discussion. But I think one dimension that might tie into some of the other questions that you were asking could have to do with the way in which safety has been a kind of slogan for the left for a long time now, right? And so has as I've pointed out in various of my writings and interviews and discussions, an overinflation of the problem of harm, and an attempt to say that if you offend me by your speech, you have done me harm. And I think this is a false equation. So I think what has happened, in other words, is that you've had a situation for the last couple of decades now, if not longer. I mean, I could trace it back to the mid-90s, sort of a zero tolerance for offensive speech in classrooms in Ontario, for example. So you have a situation in which there's been a lot of crying wolf going on, right? And so now, when you really need words to matter, and you need people to adhere in a very serious way, in an urgent way, to safety protocols, you have the right flouting them, as they would have challenged, this too great an emphasis on safety. So I think that is a dynamic that is quite interesting to me. So now let's look at the situation in the university. I think this is becoming ever more prevalent as as time goes by. It seems almost with every week and month and year that passes, there's a kind of heightened concern around safety. Now, as an educator, I'm of course aware of the need to create the conditions within the classroom where genuinely searching and inquiring questions can be posed and discussions can be forged. Absolutely, there is a relationship here between conditions of safety and the possibility of what one could call, somewhat dangerous conversations, where, I mean, let's face it, education is about taking some risks, putting your most cherished values and beliefs on the line, opening them up for critical scrutiny, not least by yourself, after you have engaged or in the process of engaging with other viewpoints that are quite different, right? So I think there's a kind of dialectic between the conditions of safety, safe spaces in a sense, and the possibility of dangerous conversations. The problem lies in making a fetish out of safety to the point where we lose track of what education is about. Education must happen when people feel comfortable to exchange ideas in a robust way. But if safety becomes fetishized to the point where that exchange can no longer happen, we've lost sight of the educational mission of the university. And we're really in danger of that, I think. And this is this has many reasons, or there are many causes. It's overdetermined. But one of the things that we cannot forget is the fact that over the last 20, 30 years, maybe since the beginning of the so-called neoliberalism, say 40, 50 years ago, the university has been turned into a kind of corporate entity, which no longer has a relationship with students, but rather with clients, stakeholders, customers, consumers. And so the customer is always right. And if the customer feels offended or uncomfortable, well, then something must be done. So I think this is where we're at. In terms of the online and remote setting for, pedagogy, for teaching and learning, I think that it is mostly detrimental, I think, to an authentic exchange of viewpoints and ideas. I think that there is a lot of anxiety that students feel around engaging in this sort of remote setting, and of course the conditions are not particularly propitious to for students to feel comfortable. I mean, we're all a bit on edge, and professors and TAs, as you yourself might have experienced this past year, there's a sense of being profoundly profoundly unsettled by where we're at. However, I do think that the online context can be quite useful in some ways as well, insofar as, and I've done this myself, having guest lecturers come and participate in discussions, do a talk, engage with students, and they can be halfway across the world. And I think this is great. And I think that, for me, and there's a chance we might come back to this point, for me, it's really necessary to always have a cosmopolitan perspective on the world, a kind of grounded cosmopolitanism, insofar as one is engaging where one lives and where one calls home, the kind of world in which one exists, but with full awareness and consciousness of the fact that there are other worlds, there are other contexts, there are other forms of life that are quite radically different from one's own. And so that, in a way, always has this salubrious effect of provincializing everything that one does. And that is really important. And I think in North America, we lose sight of that. We feel that we are, however decolonial we want to be, we're at the center of the world. And this can't be the case.
Yes, and I think the idea that the pandemic is this ultimate kind of universalism, but in this sort of weak sense that, it binds us all together despite the radical, discrepancy between the way nations have been able to handle the situation. You might have seen I posted our first dispatches from 2 fellow students from the Paris Institute from the Philippines and Portugal, and the sort of situation there have been radically different. Portugal's doing very well currently. The Philippines, as you are aware, is not. So I think the radical cosmopolitanism, in the sense of sort of taking stock of difference, is essential to the sort of project that I'm involved with the student ambassadors. So I appreciate you drawing attention to that.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
And turning to sort of another bookend of your many adventures in thought, I was wondering if you could speak to the sort of need to continue the substantive critique of identity politics that you and others such as Slavoj Žižek and Todd McGowan have launched. Why is this a pressing issue for the left specifically?
Well, thank you. That's such an important question, and one that really deserves a very long and involved answer. But I think I can give you a kind of snapshot of one. And I feel very flattered to be put in the same company as Zizek and McGowan. I would say that on the one hand, I think it's really important to recognize the contribution of the early theorists of identity politics,
Yes.
the Combahee River Collective.
Mm-hmm.
The central idea there is that we must be the authors of our own liberation.
Mm-hmm.
And who's the we? I mean, the we is really the identity of identity politics,
Mm-hmm.
which is to say, an African-American feminist lesbian collective
Mm-hmm.
that recognizes that in the various formations of the left, there's no one that's actually militating for their specific interests. And I think this is really key, right? So that's then developed also into a notion of intersectionality. And I think it's a really a valuable contribution to look at the different ways in which structures of oppression intersect. However, and Asad Haider has pointed this out, and others have besides, but Haider's book is particularly good in looking at the way in which it has turned, identity politics has turned from this radical socialist feminist transformative project into something that has been taken over by, in a very cynical way, the kind of managerial class that has administered neoliberalism. You saw that in 2016 with Hillary Clinton and her own use of the term intersectionality. You see it now with the current Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris. And of course, you know what's been floating around in the last while has been this recruiting video made by the CIA, which actually also uses the term intersectional. So it's quite interesting the way this has been taken up. And I think, one of my key arguments would be that this can only be possible if you understand, say, class as simply one of many modifiers for a given identity, right? So you hit race, gender, sexual orientation, and so on, and class is included as well. But class almost seems incidental.
Yes.
So rather, and so unlike those other aspects of identity, class is something quite different. Insofar as if you think class in a radical way, you think of its abolition, right? Class should be signified and placed in a political struggle, should be, it should center a political struggle that is, in a dialectical way oriented towards the very abolition of class society, and therefore class as an identity, right? That would be the utopian horizon of socialism, right? A kind of politics of radical equality. The other identity markers don't function in the same way. I mean, your sexual orientation requires recognition. You want that to be recognized and valued, and that's very reasonable, obviously, right? Your racialized identity as well. Maybe in a future society that will change radically, but there's still something about your racial identity that you want to have affirmed. So I think that this kind of misrecognition of the centrality of a negative understanding of class is what makes it then possible for the Hillary Clintons of this world, or the Jagmeet Singhs of this world to use identity in ways that are quite politically opportunistic. So it's not just, also I want to make this point that it's not just the likes of, myself and Haider and Zizek and Todd McGowan that are raising these criticisms of identity politics. It's also, the kind of prehistory of identity politics in Frantz Fanon. If you read The Wretched of the Earth, this is a powerful critique of identity politics, a politics that's geared to race and nationhood, and wants to inject class into the discussion, and it does in a very powerful way. So there's a kind of, there is this prehistory, and this aspect of Fanon is often simply elided because it's uncomfortable or it's inconvenient.
Right. Thank you for that. And this brings me to my next question. Why are you in particular poised to launch this critique? I was hoping you might share with us some of your own experiences of identity politics within and outside of the institution.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, it's something that I think is really important to register, because otherwise it looks like what I'm trying to do is something very pernicious, if not downright, reactionary. But my position is that, like the Combahee River Collective, whose theorists, whose protagonists are speaking from their experiences as racialized women, I also speak from my own, or I speak through my own experiences, which I understand to be mediated. They don't just sort of sit there and speak for themselves, but they're reflected upon conceptually, and I think that they're key to get across. And to be just sort of fairly brief about it, I mean, I come from a family with roots in East Africa. My grandparents emigrated from the western part of northwestern part of India, which is a state called Gujarat. The current Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, comes from Gujarat, and so I mean, I have a good sense of where this where this government is coming from in some sense as a result of that. So my grandparents emigrated to East Africa seeking a better life. I mean, this is a familiar story of emigration, of self transformation, of existing in a kind of diasporic way. And I myself was born in Nairobi, and we had family throughout East Africa, which used to be called the East African Economic Community. So in Tanzania, Uganda, and also, of course, Kenya. My parents arrived, as you mentioned in the introduction, with me in tow as an infant in Canada in the mid-1960s. But my family that remained behind in Uganda was expelled in 1972. And one of the justifications for such an expulsion, I mean, this was a kind of a matter of dictatorship and decisionism. This is, Idi Amin's coup, which then led to various kinds of policies of Africanization and of ultimately expelling, the middleman, right? The merchant class, which was basically the Asians in that country. So already from a very young age, I was quite well aware of the way in which ethno-nationalism can lead to forms of oppression, domination, exclusion, and so on. And then, of course, I became aware of the history of the 20th century, and I put two and two together, and things started to make a kind of sense to me. At the same time, though, I was quite well aware, in addition, of the nature of caste in my own community, right? And so caste already suggested to me that within, particular communities, there are very sharp divisions, and there are forms of oppression and domination within those communities. So I think what identity politics seems to do is emphasize the differential relations and hierarchies between communities, right? Between identities, at the cost of understanding forms of hierarchy within those communities. And I know intersectionality tries to do this, but I think in effect, there is always reference to some larger identity that takes precedence, right? And within that, or that then becomes a kind of ideological justification for these hierarchies, for forms of domination within the communities. So I would say, let's always focus not just on difference between identities, but also difference within those identities, or within the communities that purport to embody certain forms of identity. So, I mean, to summarize, very well aware of the domination, the domineering, let's say, and oppressive role of the Amin regime, which in many ways was responding to the absolutely horrific racism of the Asian community to the African community. That is without a doubt, and I want to make very clear, doesn't justify the treatment of my people, but one can understand it, and that has to be an important dimension of this discussion. But then one also understands the forms of domination, not least gender domination, within the Asian community, underwritten by a certain interpretation of Brahminical Hinduism and so on, which we can't get into right now. But this is what this is always at the back. This is always the background or the backdrop to my skepticism of identity politics.
Right. Well, thank you for that, Samir. And I'm going to try and blend two questions because I think they sort of, work as one. Many intellectuals on the left sort of sidestep or short circuit the phenomenon of cancel culture, though you do not. And I'm wondering why you think it's so important to address this phenomenon. And if we could bring this into a sort of psychoanalytic register, why should we problematize the enjoyment that we get from judging other people? Is there a way on the left that we can kind of hold on to critique without passing into this sort of enjoyment or judgment of judging other people that's often extremely tinted by a sort of moralism that we now find as quite ubiquitous?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think I'm probably one of the few on the left. Very much consider myself on the left, if that hadn't been clear already. Who says, yeah, actually, cancel culture is a thing, and the reason I think that is because there are leftists canceling other leftists. Cancel culture is it kind of emerges as sort of right-wing talking point to express dismay, to put it mildly, when conservative speakers, for example, are canceled, which I actually don't agree with. I mean, I think we need to know thy enemy, know thine enemy, and when people like Harvey Mansfield, the Harvard-based political theorist, the theorist of masculinity, also a translator and editor of Machiavelli, is canceled, I think, by Concordia University. This is a big problem. We can disagree with the Harvey Mansfields of this world. We must challenge their views and take them to task. But nobody is served by having people like that canceled. So yeah, I think it is emerged as a right-wing talking point, but it's not as if the right can't be correct occasionally, just as a broken clock is right twice a day.
Mhm.
And so I think there's this worry that, oh, if I use this language and I align myself with the right, I'm taken to be a conservative, what have you. That might be the case if you don't actually provide reasons and evidence, examples for your view. But I can give you many, and I have actually provided many examples, lots of evidence for the existence of cancel culture, not least the cancellation by the Democratic Socialists of America of an event that Adolf Reed Jr., an important critic of identity politics, was supposed to speak at because of his supposed class reductionism.
Mhm.
He may well have a class reductionist perspective. In graduate school, some of my best friends were class reductionists. That's fine. Then argue against class reductionism, right? Or maybe you will wish to agree, as somebody has said, perhaps we need class reductionism because reality is class reductionist. I think that's a very naive thing to say from a philosophical standpoint, but let's have a discussion about it, right? So I think, cancel culture is a thing. And I do find the psychoanalytic perspective useful here in terms of the kind of Lacanian problematic of jouissance, the idea of a kind of pleasure that tips over into discomfort or even a certain kind of pain, which one can understand in terms of a kind of self-sacrificing logic, right? That one feels compelled to participate in this game of cancellation while knowing deep in one's heart that at some point one could oneself be canceled, because there is no position of moral purity. We all have desires and drives, fantasies that are not pure. I mean, this is the lesson, the fundamental lesson of psychoanalysis, isn't it? And so, what happens then if that is revealed in some form of parapraxis? One slips up and says something that one shouldn't have, or one likes a tweet that one should not have, or one follows somebody who then says something objectionable, and then one's discovered to have followed this person and then is guilty by association. So, you can see where the logic is pointing. The logic is pointing to the fact that everybody, in a sense, is cancelable, right? And this is especially the case if we take a view of the present from the future. Think of our foibles today and how they might appear to a generation 10 years from now, 20 years, 50 years from now. Who will be read? Who will, be morally pure enough to withstand the logic of cancellation, assuming things go in this direction?
Right.
I rather hope that it doesn't go in this direction, but it very well could. So if you extrapolate this logic, then we will be retrospectively canceled. And so maybe we should just stop writing and thinking and talking, because everything we do is morally suspect. I mean, that is the logic, isn't it?
Definitely. And one might think in a sort of self-ironic state of reflection that the sort of world cancellation might have invited us to sort of, think about why we desire these prohibitions on language. And so I really do appreciate the sort of psychoanalytic register for sort of going deep into this sort of opaque core of this phenomenon, because I don't think the free speech discourse necessarily penetrates that sort of abstract aspect of it. There's a certain opacity at play there that I don't think many of us want to really engage with, because it's, as Mary Rudy would put it, the kind of bad feelings and so on that we love to avoid.
Yeah. Well, the bad feelings that we love to avoid, but that we also love.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that what we're touching upon when we talk about cancellation, um, when it works in the cultural realm, it really is about a kind of, you know, social death, a kind of reputational murder, and so on.
Right.
Um, but ultimately, what does it mean? The ultimate cancellation is, in fact, death itself. So there's a kind of, you could say there's a death drive at work here.
Mhm.
Um, and what I was getting to a bit earlier, in terms of just this kind of the jouissance of cancellation is precisely this sort of repetition compulsion,
Right.
right? That is beyond the pleasure principle. It is oriented towards something that's very dark, and very destructive, I think.
Yes, and I really appreciate you shining light on that because it's been quite hideous to see, really formidable public philosophers like Nina Power and others to be totally attacked in really sort of irrational and uncharitable ways. So, I mean, critique has to have some form of charitability. I mean, one can be ruthless and
Absolutely.
still, you know, sort of recognize the worth of difference. So I
Absolutely.
appreciate that
Yeah,
you're honing this critique, as many people have fallen mute who should not have fallen mute, if I may say so.
yeah, no, agreed. And I mean, just the last point here, it seems that you do have figures like Adolf Reed Jr. is a very powerful, figure, uh, being canceled, but I think overwhelmingly it's women who are bearing the brunt of this. And I think of Rebecca Tuvel. I mean, notice the irony of the fact that philosophy is particularly underrepresentative of the population in terms of gender balance, right? And you have an assistant professor at the time who writes this piece for Hypatia, on the possibility of transracial identity, and 800 plus faculty, including a former supervisor, write a letter that demands the retraction of this article. I mean, this is potentially very damaging. I think she was fine; she came through unscathed. But boy, oh boy, talk about somebody's reputation and therefore future career on the line. This is absolutely unacceptable, really.
No, I couldn't agree more. And as a student of philosophy at the time, I was utterly unsettled by the entire process or lack thereof of the Tuval case, and how philosophy was quite unwilling to really sort of deal with the situation or address it in any sort of meaningful way. But yeah, I am grateful that she was able to sort of hold her own, and because other people have not had that sort of institutional support in the final analysis. So yeah, we don't have a kind of shortage of examples, I suppose. And
So
you've drawn from quite a few, and yeah, I do appreciate that. But I wanted to return to a question, or rather begin a question on a sort of article that you wrote for the LA Review of Books in 2020. And as the question of fascism, or the sort of concept, has been on everyone's lips, one might appeal to analogy or periodization. And in some cases, one might whip out a template or a sort of checklist to say, this is fascism, we sort of need it, here's the checklist. And some are wondering whether Trump is or is not a fascist, and that is a sort of question that you have taken up, if I understand correctly. And might the distinction that Alberto Toscano in a recent talk on new fascisms makes between the temporalities of fascism be useful here, such that is our current conjuncture a time of fascism or a time for fascism?
yeah, that's a really good question, and I have tremendous respect for Alberto's work, and I think his work on late fascism is very thought provoking and fascinating. I touch upon it in the introduction to Spectres of Fascism, but I don't maybe give it the do it the justice it deserves. It is, after all, an introduction. But I think that it's useful to think about temporality in this way, you know, of time for fascism, objective conditions, time of fascism, sort of subjective, and then the time sort of in fascism or in fascist times. And I think his conclusion seems to be what distinguishes late fascism from the fascism of the 20th century, from the 1920s and 30s. And, you know, of course, is arguing against this analogy that we don't learn anything if we just simply say that, you know, we're back to a kind of Weimar moment. I think this is really lazy way of thinking. So he rightly points this out. The analogy is not helpful. So with Ernst Bloch, he wants to try and think about the plural temporalities, you know, and his view seems to be that there's a kind of greater plurality of temporalities marking the unevenness of capitalist development in the 20th century, whereas what we find today is a greater push to synchronize. You know, what fascism today is oriented towards is a fully synchronous temporality. I'm not so sure I agree with that. It might be the case in, you know, in the global north, maybe in the United States, in Europe, but I'm even not sure that's really the case either. But let's say that it might function in the global north. It certainly cannot be said to function, though, in the global south. I mean, I think if you look at Narendra Modi, for example, the attempted creation of a kind of Hindutva imaginary in India. So India that is essentially a Hindu nation. So there's the claim that Muslims and members of other religious groups were once Hindus who were converted forcibly into these other religions. So they need to be reconverted back to Hinduism, or they need to leave. So there's an attempted sort of purity, you know, a politics of purity. Again, identity politics, you know, in a certain register, which is also interesting because it presents itself as sort of anti-colonial. It feeds off the post-colonial anti-Marxism of the subaltern studies group and so on. Because of course the Muslims were colonizing force. The Mughals were colonizing force. So there's a sort of blending of left and right tropes in this context. So my point is, though, it's both a, you know, this sort of hyper modernizing language. You see this with the legislation that has provoked such an enormous response from the Indian farmers, right? That would essentially lead to a commodification of farmland and so on, and exacerbate the already difficult situation of the agricultural sector and of the farmers in particular. This is part of a kind of modernizing logic. So it's one that's very much oriented towards, you know, the future, sort of a kind of accelerationism, you could say, but it's one that's also very backward looking in terms of a refashioned Hindu identity. There's notions, you know, that kind of these ancient Ayurvedic remedies could be used now in place of certain forms of modern medical science and so on. And I think the pandemic today in India, which is absolutely out of control, it's catastrophic, has something to do with his deep ambivalence towards modernity, right? You have market forces unleashed, but at the same time, skepticism of Western science and Western notions of human rights and so on. So that doesn't strike me, in other words, as a kind of synchronous temporality. Rather, it's one that's deeply contradictory. So it'd be an interesting discussion to have with Alberto.
Yes, definitely. And I will share with listeners your article, because I found the sort of distinction between a sort of post-human fascism, which you discuss at length, and a sort of anti-humanism, if that was the distinction. Very interesting, and not something that I've seen very often, especially with, you see a sort of left-wing embrace of post-humanism, and there really isn't a substantive enough critique, this sort of bizarre technophilia and fetishism that we're also finding on the left. So I think, yeah, that's definitely an interesting article that I will circulate with our listeners as well. And I just wanted to touch on a final question regarding a recent and very interesting talk that you gave on Adorno and identity politics, where you discussed the successful strategy of right-wing populism and its identification with or as an aggressor, which seems to grant the illusion of having one's enmities represented in some meaningful way. And I think it would be great for us to sort of end on this point, like, how does this implicate the left? And how might we, in returning to our previous discussion on the desire to cancel, sort of abandon these prohibitions, you know, on language? You know, you've also said about, you know, the right engages in transgression while the left in moralism. So how can we sort of understand both this sort of identification with the aggressor, with right-wing populism, and sort of the effect, I guess, on the left?
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. I think that my theorizing of right-wing populism more generally, is indebted to the Frankfurt tradition, of course, but in particular, this book by Löwenthal and Guterman, called Prophets of Deceit. And in that book, the authors, you know, essentially say that we can classify three different kinds of, you know, responses to a socioeconomic situation, a crisis. And in that we can isolate the, let's say, different positions on the political spectrum, right? And so say that, you know, in the face of a socioeconomic crisis, you have the left, you have a kind of revolutionary and a reformist wing of the left, both of which engage in a kind of a structural analysis of the conditions of the crisis and its causes, and articulate two distinct programs of action. You know, of course, the revolutionary wing of the left wants a total transformation of society, and what we were talking about earlier, right, in terms of a destruction of class society, right, and a truly equitable distribution of power and wealth. The reformist wing of the left, of course, wants to ameliorate the conditions of inequality and the conditions that, therefore, the conditions that lead to the sort of social unrest that is part of the socioeconomic crisis, right? So things like progressive taxation, redistribution of wealth, protections for workers, trade union rights, so on. So that's a reformist approach. Then they focus on the right-wing approach, which would be, you know, what we would call the kind of right-wing populists, which is then the agitators. The agitators, rather than providing any kind of analysis of the socioeconomic crisis, try to identify certain scapegoats who are held responsible for it. I think this also reminds me of my own experience or my own family's experience in Uganda in 1972. You hold the middleman responsible for condition of of crisis, of an experience of inequality and injustice, and you then enact measures to deal with that particular community and those particular people. So that's exactly what the agitator does, right? And this is, think about the long-standing anti-Semitism in Europe, but more recently we can think about anti-Muslim perspectives and opinions and actions, right? Islamophobia is very much alive and well now. Today we're also talking about anti-Asian violence, etc. So what the agitator does is uses the discontent of the masses to further and it usually is a male agitator, further his own particular political agenda, right? So not providing any kind of structural analysis, simply taking the discontent of the citizenry, of the masses, and stoking it and using it and manipulating it for political ends. This is how I see right-wing populism, which often has a highly visible leader with a certain kind of contradictory charisma who does this. I mean, Trump was a master of this, right? And Trumpism hasn't gone away. So that's the situation. And I think what has happened is that the left has gotten into this game of challenging at the level of identity, right, and anti-racism and so on, the position of contemporary agitators, right? And they've sought to, in a way, harness or control or regulate the speech that comes from the agitator and the agitator's followers. But it hasn't done what it really should do, which is to provide a proper structural analysis of the socioeconomic crisis.
Right.
And in neoliberalism, crisis is, as I pointed out elsewhere, it is chronic rather than acute. It's not just a discrete event, but it has been generalized. It's really the oxygen upon which neoliberalism feeds. So the crisis today of the political crisis of deepening right-wing authoritarianism has to do with not the strength of the right per se, but its ability to mobilize a socioeconomic crisis to its own ends by blaming certain groups. And there is no countervailing force from the left to challenge this narrative adequately and to provide a different sort of analysis of the need for structural transformation, right? There's a real failure there. And it has to do, again, with my discussion of class earlier. There's a real reluctance to address in a structural way class, which means also capital, and that also means the value form. So I think that this is very much part and parcel of the conditions, of, in a sense, these are the dimensions of the time for fascism, as it were, and the time of fascism, kind of objective conditions of crisis. The 9/11 and the 2007-2008 financial crisis, I think, bookend this in some way, or they don't bookend it because we're still living through it, but they're two central moments of our crisis today. So that's, at the time for fascism. The time of fascism has to do with a paucity of real left alternatives.
Right.
And so again, the left is just preoccupying itself far too much with trying to regulate manifestations, let's say symptoms of fascism, rather than providing real alternatives to its political agenda. And I think that seems to be ongoing, really, with the defeat of Bernie in the last round of the sort of nomination battle with Biden. I think it's just an ongoing sense of that problem, right?
Yes, and thank you for that. And I hope that those who are listening to our conversation today, students, scholars, anybody who happens to be interested in these issues and some of their, what remains to be seen, the resolve. I hope our conversation can be taken as a sort of call to action, and that action includes, the hard work of thinking, which many of us need to sort of maybe take a pause between the interval and the act, as Simone Weil would say.
Absolutely. I just want to reinforce that point. It's such a good one that increasingly we must regard thinking as a political act, because certainly unthinking is deeply political insofar as it depoliticizes people. So thinking is a political act that actually can lead to real political engagement.
Certainly, and at least at PICT, we certainly believe this wholeheartedly. So thank you so much, Samir, and for the riveting discussion. And yeah, I look forward to your upcoming books and talks and engagements. So thank you.
Thanks very much for having me. Terrific questions. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you for listening to The Object Lesson, brought to you by the Student Ambassadors of the Paris Institute. If you want to support our not-for-profit volunteer work, please consider becoming a member. You can find out more at parisinstitute.org. This is Emily Laurent-Monaghan, and I hope you'll join us for the next episode.